Moms and Mysteries is the podcast where two Florida friends uncover chilling cases with humor and heart. Hey guys, I'm Mandy.
And I'm Melissa.
And we're the moms behind the mics, taking you on a roller coaster of true crime stories while adding our own brand of humor into the mix. Respectfully.
Join us every Tuesday for Moms and Mysteries, your gateway to gripping, well-researched true crime stories. We're your go-to podcast for mysteries with a motherly touch. Subscribe now to Moms and Mysteries wherever you get your podcast, and never miss a Tuesday.
Criminology is a true crime podcast that may contain discussion about violent or disturbing topics. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 349 of the Criminology podcast. I'm Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford.
Mr. Morford, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. How you doing?
I'm hanging in there. You know, my biggest problem right now is the weather. I know I talk about the weather a lot, but, you know, we're having like 60 days, some days, and then it's like 28. And that seems like a big swing, and it really messes with me.
Yeah, I don't miss that about the northern weather, but I'm sure the basketball tournament's going to keep you pretty warm with all the excitement you're going to have over that.
Yeah, I do love March Madness. It's one of my favorite times of year, so I'm looking forward to that. Let's go ahead and give our Patreon shout-outs. We had Ron, Ann Kinch, and Brian Middleton. So a lot of great new support. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you to everyone that takes the time to support the show. It really helps us out. For anyone else that would like to, you can head over to patreon.com/criminology to get started.
All right, we're diving right into this week's case. And, you know, every once in a while, we dig into a case that really kind of leaves us scratching our head due to the bizarre circumstances and clues in the case. And I think for many listeners, this may be one of those cases. We're talking about the case of Aeileen Conway, who apparently died in a fiery car accident in Oklahoma in 1986. Police ruled it an accident, but very quickly, Aeileen's husband, Pat, began to question his wife's death and the official findings.
Aeileen Conway was born in Lawton, Oklahoma, as Aeileen Anderson on June 15, 1935, to parents Pat and Frida Anderson. We don't know a lot about her life, but in her college-age years, she attended St. Joseph's Academy, a Catholic college in Guthrie, Oklahoma. While attending the school, she was active in Pep Club, Senior Scouts, and she worked on the newspaper. At some point in the early 1950s, she met Patrick Conway. Patrick, or Pat as he went by, was about 4 years older than Aeileen. He had lost his parents early in life. His father, Timothy Conway, died when Pat was just 4, and his mom, Clara Conway, died a year later when he was 5. We don't know much in the way of those circumstances, but we do know that Pat was adopted by his godparents, Joseph and Ann Brown, and he grew up close to Aeileen.
Patrick went to Our Lady Catholic High School, and almost right away, out of school, Patrick ran his own business, Conway and Hale, a flooring company. After dating a short while, Aeileen and Pat were married on October 17th, 1953, and they made their home in Lawton, Oklahoma, on the 6200 block of Northwest Cheyenne Drive. Pat and Aeileen would go on to have 7 kids, 4 daughters and 3 sons. Frustratingly, there's very little out there that we could find about Aileen's life after her and Pat were married, but Pat was very active with his kids in scouting, where he was a scoutmaster. He was also active in the Lawton School Board. He coached softball. From what we can gather, the Conway family seemed to be a happy one, living their lives in Lawton, but that would all change in April of 1986.
On Tuesday, April 29, 1986, at around 10:40 a.m., a farmer in Lawton noticed a large column of smoke rising from a dirt road not far from his property. He called the fire department. Lieutenant Larry Sally from the Oklahoma Highway Patrol arrived 20 minutes after the farmer alerted authorities. The source of the smoke was a car on fire. The car had apparently crashed into the guardrail of an old bridge and somehow caught fire, and the fire was intense. The flames grew so hot the metal guardrail and the car had melted together where they met. As he looked inside the car, the officer was horrified to see at least one person, but the car was completely engulfed in flames and there was nothing he could do to try and get them out. The only thing he could do was wait for backup. By the time the fire was put out, the body inside the car had been burned so badly that a visual identification couldn't be made, and it was unrecognizable.
And Morf, you and I talk about it a lot. You know, people out on their everyday lives, right? Stumbling upon a dead body. And that would be life altering. It would be just a major event in someone's life. Now, you know, when you're dealing with the highway patrol, they probably see a lot more than the average person. Obviously, any law enforcement would. But I would think this would be the type of incident that would stick with an officer. You know, they probably see a lot of cars on fire. But when you pull up, a car is on fire, and you notice that there is at least one person inside, and there's nothing you can do about it. That has to be, you know, number one, a helpless feeling, but also I would think that's going to stick with you.
Yeah, as an officer, first responder, you're trained to help someone if you can, but I think we all know that as much as you might want to help, when you get around fire, you just can't do anything. It's so overpowering. And I don't know, we don't have details if this guy had some kind of small fire extinguisher in his car, but from the sounds of this fire, it wouldn't have done much good because this thing was really engulfed.
The burned out car was registered to Patrick Conway, whose listed address was just 15 minutes away from the scene of the crash. It wasn't Pat who was in the car, though. While investigators were trying to make sense of the scene and pin down the identity of the deceased driver, Pat Conway was trying to find his wife, Aeileen. When he arrived home from work around noon, he noticed that her car was gone. That wasn't weird to him, but things inside the home indicated that she had not intended to leave. Aileen's purse, which had her eyeglasses and her driver's license inside, was still on the floor in the living room next to an armchair. The tub in the upstairs bathroom was full of water as if someone had drawn or just finished a bath. The phone in the bathroom, resting on the edge of the bathtub, was off the hook. The receiver had been placed directly in front of the base. An iron was plugged in and still on, sitting atop an ironing board. The back patio door was wide open, and in the backyard, the garden hose was still on, flowing into the family's pool.
It's safe to assume that most people wouldn't leave in the middle of any of those chores, let alone all of them. Sure, we all from time to time may forget something, but usually not multiple things that seem to be all going on at the same time. But to just walk out of the house with your phone off the hook, your bathtub full of water, a hose on that could potentially flood your backyard, and a hot iron on that could start a fire, that would take a lot of forgetting. It was unusual, and to Pat, it didn't add up. They had been married for 33 years, and this just didn't feel right. He knew something was wrong, and that his wife would never leave the house like this. Patrick had no idea where Aeileen went.
Now, I don't know about you, Morf, but if I got home to this scene that we just described, I would be, really worried myself. Now, granted, this is 1986. Pat can't just pull up his cell phone and track his wife or, use a locator or anything like that, which is what we would do today. But, you'd still be worried. The scene is so odd that someone couldn't help but think it's possibly something bad has happened.
And they'd been married for 30 odd years. So he would know her habits and patterns, and you just know when something's off. And, he got that gut feeling right away that something wasn't right.
When he was informed early the next day that it was Aeileen who had died in the car accident, he didn't believe it. He was devastated by the news, but despite his grief, he kept thinking back to the condition of the house. But it wasn't just the way the home had been left. It was also the location of the wreck. The scene was 15 miles away. And to his knowledge, neither of them had ever driven over that bridge or had ever even been to that area, even if she had decided to leave the home the way it was. With so many things unfinished or out of place, it still doesn't explain what she was doing in that area in the first place. Pat was sure this was not an accident. He would later tell the television show Unsolved Mysteries, "There's no doubt in my mind it was murder." Now, some people might quickly assume that, this is a grief-stricken husband and father that didn't want to accept that his wife had been killed in a tragic accident. But even if that were the case, it still doesn't explain everything that led up to the accident.
All of this uncertainty led Pat to contact District Attorney's Office investigator Ray Anderson, who was skeptical at first, thinking that Pat was just a grieving loved one in denial, looking for someone to blame. But he was willing to approach the case with an open mind. Anderson told Unsolved Mysteries, "The first impression that I had of this case when I met with Mr. Conway was that of a spouse that was left alone, not expecting the tragedy that happened, and looking for some reason why this happened, other than it just being an accident." The investigator also said he quickly realized that when you start looking at the extenuating and surrounding circumstances, the way that she left her house, it leads you to believe that there's a possibility that there could have been foul play.
And I get that. I think I would be, at the very least, entertaining some of those thoughts if I was in Pat's shoes. It would be one thing if there was nothing amiss at the house. Everything was normal and there was a car accident and your wife died. But, everything going on at this house just kind of screams out that Aeileen wasn't planning on leaving. She left in a hurry and maybe not by her own free will.
Yeah, this wasn't a case of his wife having to travel for business and she takes all her stuff with her and it's planned out. And then he gets a call from the highway patrol that unfortunately she got into an accident someplace. This just seemed like an unscheduled event, and the accident happened in a spot where he wasn't familiar with, and as far as he knew, his wife wasn't familiar with.
After a few days, Pat and investigator Anderson decided to revisit the scene. About 200 feet away from the car, Anderson found a flyer in the grass with information from a local church, which Pat said had been on Aileen's dashboard the last time he saw her and the car. Together, they came to the conclusion that the car must have stopped near the spot where he found the church flyer because it was so far away from the scene of the wreck. And according to Pat, Aeileen never drove with her windows down. If it was hot, she turned on the air conditioning, but kept the windows up. So since the flyer couldn't have flown out of the car while she was driving, it must have fallen out while she stopped, and someone, maybe her, maybe not, got out of the car, or at the very least opened the door. Now, some might say it fell out of the car when first responders were working the scene, but if that's the case, the flyer likely would have been burned up.
This flyer made investigator Anderson believe that Pat was onto something, and that Aeileen may have been a victim of foul play, and that the crime scene could have been staged by her killer. Anderson thought that someone else may have been with her, opened the door, set the accelerator, and slammed it into drive, hoping to run Aeileen off into the creek next to the bridge, and to make it appear like it was an accident. But there were skid marks from braking behind her car, which investigators estimated had been going 50 to 60 miles per hour when it smashed into the guardrail. If these skid marks were from Aileen's vehicle, which investigators do seem to believe, then someone was alive in the car just before the crash and they hit the brakes hard. One possibility is that Anderson's theory could have happened, and Aeileen may have been unconscious when she was put into the car, but came to and tried to stop the car, but it was too late.
And I think there's one thing more that we have to point out where this accident occurred. It was kind of out of the way dirt road with a bridge, right, that crossed the creek. Now, I said earlier that Pat said he didn't think he and his wife had ever traveled this road, gone across this bridge. And a lot of people were probably thinking, well, that's strange. They've lived there a long time. It's 15 minutes from their home. Little chance that you wouldn't cross a bridge that's that close to your home in many, many years of living there. So it is important to kind of describe this road and the scene.
Yeah, it's definitely not like a major thoroughfare or a bridge that's used by a lot of vehicles. This was mainly, a side off the beaten path type of bridge. And I think everybody listening probably has something in their town that is not well used, but people know about it. Just they may not have driven down it, but they know that it's there.
But doesn't that add to the mystery? Why is Aeileen on this road? Where's she going? And maybe puts it into the category of being a little more suspicious. It didn't take long for officials to change their determination that Aeileen had perished in a tragic car accident. Now, her cause of death was listed as unexplained, thanks to investigator Anderson's investigation. Looking deeper into the case, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation and the fire marshal performed evaluations and tests to try to figure out exactly what happened to Aeileen. They found a few suspicious things. Sonny Sansom of the Oklahoma State Fire Marshal's Office told Unsolved Mysteries, "What made me suspicious at first was looking at the photographs and seeing how much burn was in the vehicle. This thing was completely burnt and destroyed. The gas cap from Aileen's car was missing, which is, according to Sansom, a common finding in arson involving vehicles because the suspect hopes the flames will ignite the tank and cause more damage to the car."
Investigators obtained parts of a car similar to Aileen's for testing. They wanted to see how the dashboard and carpet burned under normal circumstances. When the sections of dashboard and carpet were lit with a blowtorch, the fire simply went out. It didn't spread, and there was no potential for a raging inferno capable of melting car and guardrail. But when the investigators lit those same parts on fire with accelerants like gas, the fire burned intensely. Investigators determined that the fire had not been caused solely by the crash. According to Sansom, without some type of accelerant like gasoline, the fire would not burn that badly.
So investigators were at least open to the idea that someone may have killed Aeileen, but they were left with the questions. Who would want to kill the 51-year-old wife and mother, and why? According to Paul Renfro from the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation, at the time of the Unsolved Mysteries interview, authorities didn't even have one solid motive that they all agreed on, saying, "We don't really have an answer, but there are a lot of theories floating around." One idea that seems to come up in this case is that Aeileen somehow interrupted a burglary in her home, and rather than fleeing or just killing Aeileen and leaving her there, her killer or killers put her in the car and drove 15 miles before crashing the car, dousing it with an accelerant, and lighting it on fire. Investigator Renfro told Unsolved Mysteries, "We backtracked a little bit into the neighborhood, and apparently there had been reports of burglaries in the weeks and months preceding this situation, so the possibility of an interrupted burglary is there."
To many people, it seems far-fetched that a burglar would go to such great lengths to kill Aeileen and make it look like an accident, especially without taking much. According to the Unsolved Mysteries webpage, there's one news article from May 1986 that mentions missing jewelry, but it doesn't specify what was unaccounted for, and there's no mention of missing jewelry in the Unsolved Mysteries episode about the case. It could be the jewelry Aeileen wore daily, or it could have been a valuable heirloom kept tucked away in a safe. We just don't know, but it certainly has the potential to be a big clue. The same article also notes that the water in the bathtub was used, as if someone had taken a bath and failed to drain the water, though it's not clear how they would determine that. With no clear motives for anyone wanting to harm Aeileen, and nobody having any grudges against her or her husband, a burglary gone wrong seems feasible. Perhaps Aeileen recognized the burglar, or burglars, if there was one or more, and they panicked and harmed her to keep her from turning them in. As we mentioned, there were some burglars in the area preceding Aileen's death, and perhaps the person that broke into her home was responsible for the other burglaries and feared that they would get in a lot of trouble.
It would be helpful to know where Aeileen kept her keys. If they were in her purse, it makes it extremely strange that the purse and her eyeglasses were still at home. It would have taken longer to get only her keys than it would have to grab the whole purse and run to the car. But if she kept her house keys on a hook or in a dish on a table near the door, then it would be easier to run past the purse and grab the keys on the way out. There was no mention of whether Aeileen kept any cash in her purse, but if a burglar went through the trouble of taking her keys from her purse, it seems like they would simply take the purse. If it was Aeileen that went out willingly for some unknown reason, it seems that she too would likely take her purse. So either way, it's odd that it was left in the house.
I don't know about you, Mike, but my wife doesn't go anywhere without her purse. And she does have a wallet with a driver's license and some other stuff in it, but she keeps that in the purse. So again, you still have the issue of if she was running out to run an errand, whatever she was doing, it seems like it would just simply be easy to grab the purse.
Yeah, I'm with you. I would say for the most part, my wife always has her purse with her. I mean, inside is like a MacGyver kit that, she could either construct a deadly weapon or, defuse a bomb. I don't know what she carries in there, but there seems to be a lot.
And I think most women, we could probably poll our listeners, a lot of them probably carry their purse or some kind of credentials, especially if you're going out driving. You'd think that most times you want to carry your driver's license at least.
Well, and I think it's just one of the big mysteries in this case. Right? Under what circumstances did Aeileen leave the house? And, why did she not grab her purse when she left?
It seems like a case where if you could answer one question, it might help you answer other questions.
Almost as if the dominoes would start to fall at that point, right? Because if you knew for sure the answer to one or, two of these questions, things might start to line up.
As for what could cause Aeileen to be in such a rush, one theory that some people think may have weight to it is that the phone was off the hook because she had just received a call that lured her out of the house for some kind of fake emergency, only to be run off the road. That may explain her leaving her purse and only taking her keys. This would also point to someone who knew her because they would need to have information about her enough to make up a story about whoever might be in trouble or in danger. What really makes this case even more mysterious is that none of Aileen's neighbors reported seeing her leave the house that day. We don't know what the street looked like back in 1986, but you can clearly see on Google Maps that today, Conway's old home is surrounded by several other homes pretty close to each other. If Aeileen left the house screaming in a panic or was forced to leave by someone, it seems likely that some neighbor might have seen or heard that.
And I think there are a couple of things to consider around that point. One is the time of day. I mean, this wasn't the middle of the night when she left. It was mid-morning. It obviously would have been, light out. The visibility likely would have been really good. Now, we don't know how many people in the neighborhood were home. Maybe a lot of people were working. We don't know all of that stuff. But the idea that, armed intruders forced Aeileen out of the house and into her car, it's not out of the realm of possibility, but you would think it would be a lot harder to do at that time of day in that type of neighborhood setting.
Yeah, and that's the puzzling piece for me about this case is the proximity of the homes, because there's not a lot of space between the homes on either side of the Conway's house or across the street from it. It's sort of a development, and It's not, we've covered cases where somebody lives out in the middle of nowhere off a highway and they don't have a neighbor for a mile away, and something could happen. You never hear or see anything, but these homes are right on top of each other. So anyone trying to do Aeileen harm would be taking a big chance that they're going to be seen or heard. And it just adds to the confusion of this case.
So if someone had lured Aeileen out of the house, it had to be someone she trusted. And since everyone that knew her would have come forward if they had info, this has led some people online to believe that perhaps Aeileen was having an affair. Unfortunately, no unsolved case is complete without salacious rumors. Other people think that perhaps she was involved with something seedy like drugs. Most of those theories have Aeileen leaving the house for a quick meetup, fully intending to return home in a few minutes. In this line of thinking, Aeileen could have left the phone off the hook so that it seemed like she was still at home and just talking on the phone if her husband called. Back then, anyone calling would have just gotten a busy signal. From the other end of the phone, there was no way to tell whether the person you were calling was actively on the phone or if their phone was just off the hook. The issues with these theories from online sleuths is that no theory really seems to fit with everything we know about Aeileen and her life. As we mentioned early on, we don't know a lot about her life because there's very little out there, but we know she was a church-going mom, and there was never any mention of her being involved in anything shady. So a lot of the theories online are definitely not based on any known facts. And people have affairs, Morf. I mean, it happens all the time. It's not out of the realm of possibility. It's also not impossible that Aeileen was into some type of drug or something like that. But, you know, a 51-year-old mother and wife, you would have to say, you know, she's in a less risky category for some of these things. Not that it couldn't happen, but is it less likely?
And I think it's only natural for people in a case like this, they start grasping at straws or throwing forward any kind of theory that, you know, could possibly explain the situation because it's just so unusual.
But here's the thing, you know, if you're going to meet someone for a quick hookup or you're going to go buy drugs, does that explain in any way the situation going on at the home? Why everything was left the way it was?
Other theories some people put forward include Aeileen having suffered a medical emergency, which caused all of her odd behavior. In this theory, the phone is off the hook because she tried to call for help, but realized she couldn't speak or was unable to dial for some reason. She would have dropped everything to run outside for help. The open door, the hose, and the iron would all become unimportant during a life or death emergency, and it would be easy to forget her purse if she was in a panic. But why would she get into the car and drive during a medical emergency, especially if she was experiencing cognitive symptoms like loss of speech, memory, or movement? If she was going to run outside anyway, why not try to run to a neighbor's house? You could knock, and then even if you couldn't talk, you could make motions, and it would probably be quite obvious that something was going wrong. Other people raised questions about the possibility of Aeileen suffering some kind of mental emergency or a breakdown trying to explain her actions that day. This line of thinking has led some to consider the possibility that Aeileen Conway took her own life. But again, just like with every other theory, there isn't enough known about Aeileen to come to any conclusions.
There is one theory that's out there online, and perhaps this one may be the hardest one to believe as possible, that being that Aeileen faked her own death. Her remains were identified, but it isn't clear how they were. As we mentioned, her body was burned beyond recognition, so it's not clear if dental records were used to ID her, but hopefully they didn't just assume it was her body. In this last theory, some people put forth that Aeileen hatched this plan, arranged to use the body to put in the car so people would think it was her that perished, and then she snuck off to start a new life. This almost sounds like something out of a movie. And we know that in some cases, really strange things do happen, but this is one of those scenarios that just seems, kind of hard to accept. And for me, Morph, the running off to start a new life is always one of the hardest scenarios for me to accept. It can happen. It has happened. But when you talk about disappearances and unsolved deaths and mysteries, I think percentage-wise, this has to be at the bottom of the list of things that normally occur, right? People faking their own death or, just leaving to start a new life.
And in this situation, there's, it's one thing if she had left her car someplace and just disappeared, then you could almost say, okay, sure, it's possible she left and started a new life. But for this situation, in this theory, it would require her to get another body from someplace that somehow passes for her. So that's for me, it just kind of loses any kind of traction.
And that's assuming that they didn't use dental records to conclusively identify her body. My assumption is they did, but we weren't able to find it in the research, so we can't say with certainty that they did. But you would think in 1986, they would have been able to conclusively ID her. They wouldn't just have made the assumption that because she was in, the family car, it had to be her.
Finally, of course, as in most unsolved cases, some people think that the victim's husband had something to do with it. In most cases, murder victims are killed by someone closest to them, and there are no shortages of cases where the husband did do it. In this case, if Pat murdered his wife or had her murdered, it literally went perfectly. The official determination was that she died in a car accident. Killing someone and having authorities not even realize it's a murder is extremely rare, and it makes absolutely no sense for Pat Conway to advocate for Aeileen and insist that her death was a murder if he was the one responsible. So we don't know where Pat was that day. We're assuming that he was at work, and it would be an easy alibi for the police to check, but one way or another, it doesn't seem like they ever considered him to be a suspect, but we just don't know what his alibi was specifically.
But assuming he was at work and, he was on his way home for lunch when he discovered how the house was, you would think that would be a pretty easy alibi to nail down, right? People either saw him at work, his boss saw him at work, or they didn't.
And just doesn't make sense that if he was somehow involved in his wife's death, why he would be screaming from the rooftops, "This is foul play. This isn't a regular car accident." So to me, that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, there have been people who have tried to throw off the authorities by acting a certain way. But in this scenario, there would be no reason to need to try to throw the authorities off because they're not looking for a murderer in the beginning. Early on, Pat Conway even offered a $10,000 reward for information in the case. That's over $25,000 today. He did eventually get remarried, but he never fully moved on. He told Unsolved Mysteries, even though you're discouraged, you keep pushing it every day. It's on your mind all the time, but somehow it needs to be solved. I'll never quit as far as trying to solve the case. He was clear that he would never stop trying to figure out the truth, saying, if I live to be 100 years old, I'll still be pushing to try to find the individual, or possibly two individuals, whoever was involved. Sadly, Pat never found the answers he was seeking, and he didn't quite make it to 100. On August 20th, 2013, Pat passed away at the age of 81. According to his obituary, he was at home and surrounded by his family.
Well, Pat never got to see the case solved, and while odds may be against it happening after nearly 40 years, perhaps it's not too late to investigate it using the most recent technology. There have been advances in the understanding of arson and fire behavior since Aeileen's death. There may have been improvements in methods or knowledge in the field of tire track identification and measurement, so it would be interesting to see if a different conclusion could be reached, like an additional set of tracks or the realization that there had never been any braking at all. at the accident scene. A reevaluation of the accident scene and evidence might be in order. And of course, who knows what clues as far as DNA or fingerprints might have been found in the Conway's house. The issue there is that since they didn't consider foul play initially, investigators likely didn't treat the home as a crime scene and collect evidence. And any evidence that was in the car likely was destroyed by the fire.
And I think this goes back directly to something that we've talked about before, but it's, not treating a scene as a crime scene, thinking that there's no foul play. So, the police don't do some of the things that they would normally do, right? Collect evidence, dust for fingerprints, all of that kind of stuff. Well, then when you go back and you start to think, well, maybe there was something that happened, you're left with a lot less to work with, essentially nothing to work with, because you didn't do much at the crime scene.
Yeah, and I think once you've made a conclusion that there's no foul play involved and you fail to tape off that scene and go in and looking for evidence, it allows the family to come home, to move around in the house. The kids were in there most likely, so valuable clues could be lost if it turns out that it was a crime. So maybe they should err on the side of caution and treat it as a suspicious death first until they can say conclusively that it was just an accident.
Yeah, and I always think that's the case, but I get it. Not everything at the onset is suspicious to everyone. For me, when it comes to this case, there was just so much going on at the house that made it look as though she left so abruptly that to me, it was suspicious. If investigators using today's technology reopen the case, maybe they would want to consider cases with similarities. And there are some cases that do share some similarities, although it's extremely likely that these other cases are not connected to Aeileen's. They are worth at least considering. The first case with striking similarities is that of 48-year-old Mary Lou Morris. We covered her case in our episode about the Mary Morris murders. In that case, Mary Lou Morris and Mary McGinnis Morris were killed in the Houston, Texas area within 72 hours of each other back in 2000. It's Mary Lou Morris's murder that's most like that of Aeileen Conway's. Her car was found burning on a secluded road. She was found to be inside, and like Aeileen, her body was burned beyond recognition. Again, the similarities in the cases are probably just that, similarities. There's nothing to link the cases, and they're separated by 400 miles and 14 years.
The next case with similarities to Aeileen's happened 30 years before Aeileen died and 180 miles away, but the similarities are pretty striking. This investigation also began when a farmer noticed smoke. It was just after 1 p.m. in the afternoon on March 13, 1956, in Hopeton, Oklahoma. He didn't call anyone about the smoke because it was common for people in that area to burn brush, and he figured that's what it was. It wasn't until almost 2 o'clock that another local farmer was driving with his family down a dirt road that Mildred Newland's burning car was discovered. Just as when Aeileen Conway's vehicle was burning and the first responder could do nothing to get her out of the car, Farmer Lauren Goucher could see a body inside the car surrounded by flames. It was obvious that even if he could get the door open and remove the victim, it wouldn't help them.
Also, just as in Aeileen Conway's case, highway patrol officers used the tire tracks made in the dirt to piece together a sequence of events. According to the Enid News and Eagle, it appeared that Mildred's car had crossed into the wrong lane and stopped before zigzagging backward in reverse. Then, back in drive, the car crossed the road again and hit a tree in a ditch on the side of the road. The car was backed up a second time, and once again it was driven across the road, ramming into the fence next to the tree it had already hit. For the third time, the car reversed back onto the road. Investigators believe that it was at this point, stopped on the road, that a fire started. There was evidence that the car drifted forward about 14 feet before coming to its final stop.
The movements of this case are just as puzzling, if not more, than the car movements in Aeileen's death. While her car, at first glance, appeared to have crashed at a high speed and burst into flames after striking a guardrail, Mildred's car had crossed the road 3 times, hit something twice, and only caught fire after being reversed back onto the road. Those seem like very intentional actions. You have to switch gears multiple times for that situation to have happened, and it's not at all an accident that could happen during a normal drive, where Aeileen's crash, even with the skid marks, could have been a freak accident. Maybe she was driving too fast for the dirt road, or maybe there's a pothole or an animal that made her swerve, and then even though she tried, it was too late to stop the car.
The scene here in Mildred's case strongly indicated the presence of at least one other person. One of her shoes was burned near the left rear fender of the car, but the other one was near the fence across the road. A red stain on it would later be identified as human blood. There were also drops of blood near the shoe and a patch of grass that was visibly flatter than the rest. Authorities couldn't tell whether someone had fallen down in the grass or whether 2 people had struggled. According to the Enid News and Eagle, 4 burnt buttons, possibly from a blouse, were found less than 60 feet from the point at which investigators believe the fire began. Metal bases from 2 12-gauge shotgun shells were found inside the car, but it couldn't be determined whether or not they had been fired. 75 feet west of where the fire started, there were 3 9mm shell casings found. A local man admitted days later that the casings were his, but clarified that he had been shooting there in that spot days before Mildred's death.
Even the way Mildred's body was positioned in the car when it was found was incredibly odd. She was sitting in the driver's seat, as you would expect. She was laying down across the front seats with her feet in the driver's seat, near the steering wheel, and her head in the passenger seat. She was on her back with her arms crossed over her chest. Just like the fire in Aeileen's car had burned incredibly hot, the fire in Mildred's car seemed impossible to have been a normal fire, one set without accelerants. Her body was very badly damaged. She was completely unrecognizable, and most of her body wasn't even attached anymore. The windshield actually melted from the heat of the flames. The melting point of glass is well above what is normally seen in a car fire, so investigators looked into different possible accelerants. Even using gasoline, they couldn't recreate such a hot and destructive fire. When they used a quart of brake fluid, investigators got exactly what they were looking for. In just 2 minutes, the brake fluid created an explosion, and the fire grew hotter than the melting point of glass. Police later learned that Mildred had purchased a quart of brake fluid just before starting her drive.
We know the fire in Mildred's case burned for a long time, since the first farmer noticed the smoke around 1 p.m., and the second farmer discovered the car still on fire closer to 2. If the fire reached the container of brake fluid, eventually it would have burst or leaked and then quickly caused the fire to grow incredibly hot, which ended up melting the windshield. Ultimately, Mildred's death was determined to be accidental. But like the other 2 cases we discussed, there are those who have doubts. Kenny Cole, the former chief of the Alva Police Department, told the Enid News and Eagle, "I've thought about this case many a night, laying in my bed. That girl was fighting for her life, all the way up the hill and back down."
As strange as Aeileen's death may seem, the deaths of Mary Lou Morse and Mildred Newland show that deaths involving car fires are not that uncommon. It's interesting that all 3 deaths have different determinations. Aeileen's remains unexplained, Mildred's was reclassified as an accident, and Mary Lou Morse was clearly murdered. And if anyone wants to destroy evidence that may link them to a murder, sometimes fire is the best way. Did that happen in Aeileen's case? We may never know the answer.
If you have information about the death of Aeileen Conway, you can send the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation your tip by emailing cold.case@osbi.ok.gov. So Morf, as we wrap this one up, we did talk about several different cases involving women being burned in car fires. There are some similarities. There are some differences. I think, in going back to the situation with Aeileen, the one thing that I can't stop thinking about is the way that the house was left. If she took a bath and didn't even let the water out, as some investigators have theorized, you have the phone that's off the hook, and the phone is on the bathtub. And then you have what appears to be her filling up the pool in the backyard with the hose still running. And of course, a hot iron on an ironing board. These are just things that normally people would not leave the house before turning off, putting up. I mean, there are real hazards to occur from leaving some of this stuff unattended.
Yeah. And, maybe if it was just one of those things, you could say, okay, she simply forgot it. But when you have all of that together, then you have the fact she didn't take her purse with her or her eyeglasses. The whole mystery of what happened in that house and why it was left like that is one of the biggest questions here. And I think the other one is, why did she wind up on that dirt road out in the middle of nowhere and get into that accident? It just seems like a spot she wasn't familiar with, as far as her husband knew, sort of out in the middle of nowhere. So those two things for me are the biggest questions in this case.
So then if we kind of take the road that this was a murder, however it happens, whether somebody came into the house and they were able to get Aeileen out into her car without being seen in this neighborhood, or it was a phone call that kind of lured her out of the house, and then somebody got to her and killed her and made this look like a car crash, then you kind of have to delve into the motive. Why would someone want to kill this 51-year-old wife and mother? And obviously, a lot of times, if you can answer the question of motive, it goes a long way in helping law enforcement solve the case.
And unfortunately, I think after all this time, the evidence is evidence in that car was destroyed. We touched on they probably didn't collect any evidence from the house. I don't hold out much hope that the case can even be solved. Pat's not alive anymore. He can't be questioned again to see if he remembers anything. So unfortunately, I think this is one of those cases that, barring something extraordinary happening or a tip coming in, I don't know that we'll ever have answers.
But the one thing you would have to say is that it's incredibly mysterious. The set of circumstances that we laid out, it's just mystery after mystery. With the biggest being, what exactly happened, who did it, and why. But that's it for our episode on Aeileen Conway. If you love the show, but haven't done so yet, take a minute, go out, give us a 5-star rating, leave a review. Also, keep telling your friends. Word of mouth about the podcast really goes a long way.
If you want to find us on social media, we're on X with the handle @CriminologyPod. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/CriminologyPodcast. And you can join our Facebook discussion group, Criminology Podcast Discussion and Fans.
So that's it for another episode of Criminology, but Morf and I will be back with all of you next Saturday night with a brand new episode. So until then, for Mike
and Morf,
we'll talk to you next week.
Take care, everyone.